Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this webinar, How to Be an Effective Leader in a Crisis. I'm Vivian Russell, I'm Head of Communications and Content here at CIPFA, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. Before I introduce our panellists, just a reminder that we do want this to be an interactive event, so please do send in your questions via the question box on the GoToWebinar dashboard you should be able to see on your screens. You can send a question in at any time you like. There's no need to wait until the end of the presentations. So this is one of a series of webinars CIPFA is organising that we hope will be of interest and some practical help to members and other interested stakeholders. And we're going to be examining some of the issues emanating from the current COVID-19 pandemic that we're kind of in the middle of at the moment. So today we're looking at leadership in a crisis. How can you adapt your leadership style when faced with a situation that's very much not business as usual? So to explore this issue today, I'm delighted to welcome a really fantastic pair of speakers who bring both local and central government perspectives. Joanna Killian is Chief Executive of Surrey County Council. And Sir Michael Barber is a world-leading authority on government effectiveness, and of course he's well known as the founder and went on to lead the Prime Minister's delivery unit in 10 Downing Street. He ran that until 2005 under Prime Minister Tony Blair. So before I hand over to the first speaker, just another reminder to please send your questions in via the question box so that Joanna and Michael can respond to them after the presentations. So I'm going to hand over to Joanna Killian, who is our first speaker. Joanna is currently Chief Executive of Surrey County Council, and she's worked in and alongside the public sector for many years. She's spent time as an advisor to local and regional government with KPMG, as well as 9 years as CEO at Essex County Council, and she has deep experience in delivering transformational change and service improvement. So Joanna, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me this morning. I'm going to touch on 5 themes, and these have been sort of very present in my mind over the last few weeks as Surrey, along with its partners, have come together to address the extraordinary set of issues that have emerged from the COVID outbreak that we have seen. I joined Surrey just over 2 years ago, and at that point the council had found itself in quite a difficult position. Financially, the council was struggling to understand how it could make further savings and transformational change to ensure it could live within its means. A number of services were demonstrating failure. We had just had a second Ofsted that had deemed council services to be inadequate. So it's an interesting and difficult time to join the council, and CIPFA did some great work with us to help us understand the depth of our financial issues, and have helped us to deliver a turnaround, which is just as well, because 2 years on, we, like many other authorities, have found ourselves in a position of having to work in the most extreme circumstances, and the corporate competence that we now have has meant that we have been able to survive this with extraordinary political leadership around us. I would suggest, for me in particular, there are probably sort of 5 facets that have helped us get through this. One for me is, I think, leading beyond sort of command and control. I think as modern leaders, we like to think that we're inclusive and engaging, and that has definitely been my style. But actually, this crisis has taught me that actually you have to lead sort of affirmatively and clearly through a crisis as you begin to manage a response. And to get that sense of purpose has been absolutely critical as we've had to change a style of leadership So I think I have moved from being seen as inclusive and collaborative to a leader that has set a very firm direction, has had to be much more sort of authoritative and clear, but at the same time sort of engaging with staff and partners to be able to pull through sort of hard and quickly as we faced problems and scenarios that were unimaginable, actually. I think it's also true that in a crisis you need partners, collaborators around you more than ever. So I have, through the last 2 months, also been chair of our strategic coordinating group as part of the Local Resilience Forum. So working intensely with partners to set a very clear direction, understand the sort of the critical issues that we needed to address as a group of peers, and working hard again in a highly directional mode to get things done, but always with a sense of common purpose. So again, many of us acting outside a normal set of behaviours, but a tolerance from other people that we were doing the right thing. We had a clear sense of purpose. We had shared goals. We were clear about the effect that we wanted to deliver together. And always at the heart of this was trying to do the right things for super vulnerable people, and, you know, lighting on those issues that we thought would be critical to support our communities, supporting vulnerable people, making sure that we had enough PPE, focusing early on the complexity of our sort of care settings, knowing actually that we need to sort of distribute support and aid quickly and effectively into those residential care home settings where we knew there would be problems, but always with the sort of superordinate goal that our job was to protect the NHS, save lives. And that, I think, became a compelling mission, which meant even at times of fracture and exhaustion, you know, we had this clear sense of direction that we were delivering in a partnership. We've learned as we've gone along, these are the most sort of exceptional circumstances, and I guess many of us would have had our playbooks from all of our emergency planning about how to deal with the flu pandemic. I mean, all of that, you know, has been put to one side in a way. The testing and trialling and practice has been extraordinarily helpful, but it's been a sort of compound impact of many factors that has meant this has been a difficult thing. So we have chosen to learn as we go every week, every month. It has been sort of important to stop, pause, think about what we could have done better, build on what we know has done really well. And dealing with ambiguity has been hard, and leading in those circumstances has been tricky, particularly for some of our staff who've been tired and exhausted and want sort of clear tram tracks, and sometimes it hasn't been possible to do that. But always holding our nerve and wrapping our arms around staff, particularly frontline staff who have really seen some extraordinary difficult things, seeing many of the people that I've cared for lose their lives. It's been really difficult. So sustaining a sense of purpose in ambiguity has been hard. I think the other thing for me has been about style. As I said, I've had to flex my style, and sometimes that's been difficult working outside a set of preferences. But what I do know is what I've always found to be critical in good leadership is about empathetic leadership. And it's easy to say, and I'm sure, you know, lots of journals have spoken about it frequently over the last few weeks, but actually feeling and being seen to sort of feel the sort of pain of our residents, our staff, sometimes being seen to be soft, showing emotion, really trying to stand in the shoes of our residents who have lost friends and family, thinking about staff who have lost their lives through this. You know, for me, the most important characteristic has been actually very strong, decisive, over-controlling leadership at times, but sort of coupled for me with huge sort of empathy and admiration, and I think an overwhelming sense of sort of humility, actually, about the extra miles that people have gone, the work that they have done to make lives better for people in this sort of extraordinary set of circumstances. So these are sort of the facets that I've thought about over the last few weeks and experienced. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you very much, Joanna. I'm going to now just another reminder to do please send your questions in before I hand over to Sir Michael. So our next speaker is Sir Michael Barber. He's the founder and chairman of Delivery Associates currently, but has a very distinguished CV. He was Chief Advisor on School Standards from 1997 before he went on to found the Prime Minister's Delivery Unit in 2001. That ensured delivery of domestic policy priorities across the piece and was a real sort of game changer in the way kind of government is organised. He's also author of the book How to Run a Government so that citizens benefit and taxpayers don't go crazy. And yes, he now chairs Delivery Associates, which works in partnership with governments and public bodies to help them build measurable value for as many people as possible. So Michael, over to you.
Thank you very much, Vivian, and thank you, Joanna. I really enjoyed your remarks, and that that combination of being decisive and clear and empathetic and humble, I think, is really at the heart of all of this, and I thought you described it really well. I want to start with the kind of objectives of government. So if Kate, can you just put the first slide up? This is the public value assessment framework. It's taken from the report I did for the Treasury that was published with the 2017 budget, and then has been updated since and is still on the Treasury website. And this idea of public value, as opposed to simply hitting targets, which is what we did in my day in the Blair era, that this idea of public value has really taken hold in the Treasury, and the new head of public expenditure, Cat Little, is very committed to it. So are the ministers. And the idea is that in the next spending review, there'd be a clearer debate between the Treasury and government departments, and therefore with organisations such as local authorities, about what public value is made up of. And this simple diagram just describes what we proposed was indeed public value based on a reading of the literature. So the first one is pursuing goals. So for any big chunk of money, you would expect some outcomes if you're the Treasury or the government, or indeed if you're local government, wherever you are in government. If you invest a lot of money in something, you should be able to define the outcomes, and that's what we, the delivery unit, did in the Blair era. So we want the waiting times in health down, we want crime down by 30%, we want the trains to run on time more often, that kind of thing. The second bit, which is very much at the heart of a lot of what CIPFA does, is managing the inputs well, so that there is transparency, there's fairness, there's no corruption, etc., etc. And that's core Treasury work as well as CIPFA work. The other two pillars are new to this, but let me explain how they're important. The third one, and it came out actually in Joanna's comments just now, is the way government interacts with citizens or with users of service becomes really important, not just in a crisis, but at all times. If you want to solve mental health problems, you need to engage the users of the service. Mental health problems can't be solved without the sufferer engaging. So if you can strengthen the engagement, you'll get better value for the same amount of money. And similarly with citizens who may not actually be using a service but are funding it, they too are getting their engagement, or at least understanding in why that much money is being spent on whatever that service is, so much the better. And then the fourth one is about developing system capacity. So as you go through doing the other three things, are you making Surrey County Council a better, stronger, more resilient organisation for the future? And indeed, if you take it into the coming climate crisis, are you leaving the landscape of Surrey or Devon, where I live, better than you found it, or Britain if you're the Prime Minister? So the value has those four elements we're saying. And if you just take an example, if you had a manifesto commitment to plant a certain number of trees, you would map out how you were going to do that over 4 years, what numbers, where they were going to be, and so on. That would be the pursuing goals. You'd be managing inputs, you'd be finding them, deploying them well, and the people needed to do that, the better. You could just then plant them where you want to, or if you wanted to get engagement, you might do a certain number of trees might be planted by each school in your local authority, so that the children are engaged and the young people are engaged, and you can have a proper debate. And if you were thinking about the stewardship point, the fourth pillar, you'd be thinking, are these locally sourced? Are they native species? Will they be here for the long run? So you can see how the public value framework, just applied to something relatively simple like that, could make a difference to exactly what you do. So that's that. We've moved the slide on, Kate. And then in the delivery unit days, I've taken this slide which I presented to the Blair cabinet in 2004 to give you an example of what the discipline of delivery brings, which was in its early stages then, but is now being applied in many countries in the world at both local level, state level and federal level. So in Canada, for example, or 25 American cities dealing with climate change. So, and basically, I put this slide up in front of the Blair cabinet and said, government by spasm is what you did in the first Blair term, and government by routine is what we've tried to get to in the second Blair term. And that's the shift, I think, that makes for greater effectiveness, and it's very consistent with what Joanna just described, actually. And then next slide, Kate. So then you take that and you apply it into a crisis. At the beginning of this crisis, we drafted and circulated to governments all around the world, including CITFRA, who then circulated to local authorities, this crisis management checklist. And I'd be interested to know whether Joanna thinks this is consistent with her experience, but just listening to it, it sounded like that. So first of all, you've got to build a team. You need the right expertise in it. You don't want groupthink in that team. You want people to be creative and innovative, and you want people who will challenge thinking and a really vigorous debate, and then you want a decision. So you need a variety of leadership and managerial profiles. Secondly, you've got to build routines. In the peak of a crisis, you might be meeting once or twice a day. When the crisis slows down, you might be going to twice a week or something. And you want the meetings to be well chaired, executive, starting and finishing on time. And really importantly, not just having experts who know the data, but the data presented in a way that people who aren't data professionals can quickly understand. And then you've got to make decisions, and that's the job of the leader often. And it might be just that one person, but it does need to, you do need decisions, and you can't always have all of the information you'd like to have. Sometimes you just have to make a decision. And then you need a plan to kind of follow that through. So as you make decisions, making sure that there's what I'd call a delivery function or a delivery unit that's chasing up that all of those things are actually getting done on time, on standard, and then reinforcing a point Joanna made about learning the lessons and applying them. It's not wrong to learn as you go. In fact, it's the only way to get through a crisis. So learning as you go, which were Joanna's words, is really important. We talk about learning fast and learning deep. And then if you go to the final slide, Kate, and I'll just wrap up with this. You have to communicate really well. We've seen that the challenge that presents to a government, to government at national level, in getting the communication clear and sharp and regular and consistent. And then to do all of that, you need to be thinking about the organizational culture in your organization and in the ones you're working with, like Joanna was with the health service. So getting that sense of a bias fraction, team spirit, which Joanna described very vividly, and positive. There's always going to be a solution. Yes, it's difficult, and yes, it's really hard, but there's always a solution, and so on. And then I just want to emphasize the seventh point here about beyond the crisis. Even during a crisis, you don't want to drop absolutely everything else. So planning for the future is really important. In 1940, when Britain was on the brink of being invaded by the Nazis, the Battle of Britain was going on. France and Belgium and Holland had fallen. We didn't have any allies, and the Blitz was about to begin. So a pretty bad time when the odds were maybe that the war wasn't going to go our way. Even in that situation, the Board of Education in London sent 6 civil servants to a hotel in Bournemouth to keep them away from Blitz. And they said, don't worry about us, we'll do all the evacuations, we'll manage the crisis. Could you just do a draft of what the education system should be like after the war, whenever it finished? So they went away and wrote the first draft of what became the 1941 Green Paper, and then the 1943 White Paper, and then the 1944 Education Act. So right in the middle of a crisis, that kind of work can happen if you get a small group of people willing and able to do it. And also you had muted before the crisis, and there's going to be priorities after the crisis. So can you keep them in some way on track? Can you have a section of your organisation that doesn't get sucked into the crisis, that does keep driving the priorities? I did that through the 4 years I was in Number 10 when we had major international crises like September 11th, 2001, where my first instinct was to go to the Prime Minister and say, how can I help? But actually I didn't do that. I said to myself, my job is to keep the other things going. Everybody else can manage the crisis. I was in Pakistan once when they'd had a flood that covered land more than the size of Britain, more than the size of England. And I met them to talk about education reform afterwards, and they said, we've had a flood, we can't do education reform anymore. To which I, hopefully with enough empathy, I don't know if Joanna would agree, I said to them, look, I understand you've had a flood, but did the flood make your schools better? And of course it didn't. So you've still got the schools challenge you had before. Let's get back and focus on this, and then learning lessons, as Joanna was talking about. So that's the crisis management checklist. That's all I want to say, but reinforcing the point I made at the beginning, that I think there's a good chance as we come out of this crisis that the Treasury will be shifting the debate about what value you get for money onto this agenda of public value.
Unmuted.
Thank you very much, Sir Michael. It was fascinating insight into some of your experiences there. We've had several questions coming in. Just a call to say, please do send some more in. We have got quite some time now to have some questions and discussion. First one, I suppose, is one for Joanna, although Sir Michael also were welcome to chip in. Are there any lessons for national leaders for the next phase of COVID from your experiences at Surrey, Joanna?
I think for us, we set off with a very, very sort of clear goal, which was to support the NHS, save lives, and that really was a sort of corralling message that brought all of us together. I mean, this isn't meant to be a sort of political point, but I think it's hard now, isn't it, as we sort of come out of this first stage of crisis. You know, I think the sort of scientific advice is that we're likely to have some more waves of COVID in our communities. And I think genuinely it's going to be much, much harder, I think, in local areas to have a very strong message that causes people to sort of change their behaviour, actually. So I do think that in local places, you know, local politicians, community leaders, you know, have got a really sort of strong role in that. But yeah, it's just, you know, how do you communicate a clear message sort of nationally, locally, but, you know, how can we join it up in the middle better sometimes?
And did what, as Sir Michael mentioned, did his analysis of crisis management, did that resonate with you, Joanna? Did that?
I mean, the sort of the checklist that Michael presented, we know it and use it, and you know, absolutely those principles drove absolutely everything we did. I mean, particularly in the first, you know, 2 or 3 weeks when we were sort of standing up a response and having to do things, you know, absolutely at pace. The thing that resonated most for me, though, was actually sort of running business as usual at the same time, which was really tough because so much sort of capacity in the organisation was having to be shifted so quickly. And we were asking staff to sort of unwind a set of behaviours sort of immediately. You know, over the last few years, 2 years that I've been there, we've been asking social care staff to sort of think differently about how they support people. You know, all those rules, you know, out the window. But staff were saying to us, you know, please keep some of the business as usual. Keep reminding us about, you know, why we're here, what the future will be, to deliver reassurance, to give people hope that this isn't, you know, this wasn't going to be the way of life forever, but recognising some of the problems that Surrey had before would be worsened by this. So sort of digging deeper into our priorities and investing more in the things that we had set out to do a couple of years ago was an imperative, actually. So that component of Michael's framework, absolutely, it's sort of banging my head. You know, over the last couple of weeks, we have been thinking about, you know, how we reset our priorities, doing work with our partners and staff. And actually, it's really relieved a lot of tension, a lot of anxiety. You know, people have sort of slogged their guts out and are tired and want sort of certainty about the future. So it's been a good thing to do.
I should say actually that there are some resources from Delivery Associates on the SIP for COVID Hub on the SIP for website. If you go into the key resources section, there are some. There's a sort of a checklist and a toolkit to sort of that you can download that Sir Michael Barber's very kindly made freely available. So that is there. Question for you, Sir Michael. I think your crisis management checklist is quite familiar with a lot of our audience today. A question about organisational memory. How come that organisational memory appears to be lost by the current government during COVID? Is that a fair?
Well, I think organisational memory is actually really important, and it's something, and I'm not commenting on the current government, but it's something that I often find missing in national governments around the world, that that accumulation of knowledge, wisdom, experience isn't happening even at the level of history. For example, this year is the 150th anniversary of state education in England, but I don't see any recognition of that. No, we have got a crisis on, but I'd love that to be remembered. That's purely a historical point of view. I do think you have to learn from crises, and we in number 10 did systematically learn from crisis because we had, I think partly because we had a delivery unit that was accumulating that knowledge and accumulating the knowledge, not about a particular area like health or education or crime, but about how you manage crises, how you manage certain processes. And that became crucial, so that by the last part of that 4-year period when I was running the delivery unit, we kind of knew what looked like a crisis before it got there, and you could solve it now. It has to be said, that was nothing like the COVID-19 crisis, which I think is the biggest crisis that any of us have seen in our lifetime. So I think that does take it to a whole new level of challenge. What I think is important now for governments, wherever they are in the world, is to learn from each other, for systematic learning between governments. We've been working with cities in the US, so we're working with 25 cities anyway on climate change, helping them meet the Paris climate change accords, and then we're working now with through Bloomberg Philanthropies with the National League of Cities, which is 500 or so relatively small cities mostly across the United States. And with them, we've created a local action tracker so that any of the 500 cities can see what all the other 499 are doing with a named person and specified actions and a phone number, so that to enable them to learn rapidly. And that local action tracker is being constantly updated. I think that is really important. The speed of learning during a crisis is fundamentally important. And one way to learn, a very good way to learn, is through variation. And in the next phase of the crisis here in Britain, we will need variable response at local level. I think local authorities will be absolutely crucial to that. And that means really good real-time data from close to the front line, not just national numbers. And it means precise, thought through, well-informed responses that are variable according to the circumstances. And I think that's going to be the vital next stage. And at the same time, doing all that within a framework where there's a sense of solidarity, like we're going to get through this together, and a sense of creativity. We're going to find ways of solving these problems as they come.
Okay, a question about local government, but perhaps we could expand the answers to think about government, but more broadly. Will local government and by extension the rest of the public sector maybe look much different in a year? And how will its leaders need to adapt to the challenges that we don't even know about today? Thoughts perhaps from Joanna first and then Michael?
I wanted to pick up on one thing that Michael was saying. Over the last sort of couple of months, we've been absolutely led by real-time intelligence in a way that I had imagined would take years to put in place. But our actions as a council, but our actions as a group of partners in the Local Resilience Forum, absolutely have been driven by really fantastic data that we've seen before us practically every day. And it's sobering data, infection rates, deaths, but it has absolutely driven our sort of action and behaviour in the moment. And it's been really critical, I think, to get services in the right place at the right time to provide reassurance to the public. And that sort of quality of forecasting, that's one of the things I won't lose. So in terms of what, the shape of public services might be locally in the future, absolutely agree that, my life has been transformed by sort of holding on to sort of data, not spending hours, doing analysis when it's there, obvious, on a screen in front of you. I think in terms of other sort of profound change, we have an exceptionally good set of relationships with health partners in my part of the world. And we had, agreed some ambitious sort of shared transformation programs together. But in 8 weeks, we've achieved more in terms of new models of discharge, different models of discharge to assess digital change that we had imagined would take us 3, 4, 5 years. We've done in a couple of months. I think the issue for all of us now, for public services, is how do you sort of glue in those bits of leadership change, behavioural change, service change to stop us going backwards. I think that's the sort of the issue. I think if there was a post-crisis playbook or set of principles, it's that. How do you fix those things that have been brilliant? Sometimes I think public service likes to sort of spring back too easily when actually we should be looking forwards. I never thought it would be possible to be able to sort of do even very sensitive caseload reviews for vulnerable children, using sort of digital platforms. But actually, some of the children have said it feels safer to them that they can interact with us over an iPad, in their bedroom, and they have used that technology to call us actually in a crisis. That wouldn't have happened before. So, yeah, some sort of extraordinary change. The issue is about, what's the culture that would allow it to stick, but also to grow as well.
Michael, from you about how public services could look different and change?
I agree with a lot of what Joanna has just said, and thank you, Vivian. I think the crucial thing, and you can already see this debate beginning to emerge in the media, the crucial thing is when we look back in a systematic way at what happened in Britain, that is not a question of finding people to point fingers at, but of learning the lessons that are relevant in a crisis. So when I used to work go to Russia regularly, they told me that the only two phrases I needed to learn in Russian were who's to blame and what's to be done. So I did learn those two things. But in a crisis, as you come out of a crisis, the what's to be done question needs to come first, because if you ask the who's to blame question first, you really can't get everybody to talk about what's to be done, because everybody's just minding their back. So I hope we have a proper grown-up debate about what we've learnt at national level, and I'm sure every institution like Surrey County Council, or indeed the universities that I'm involved with, will be seeking to learn the lessons, and hopefully doing that in a systematic kind of way, again, without looking first of all at the blame question, but looking at what's to be done. On data, I do think there's a huge opportunity. My first experience of this at scale was in Punjab, Pakistan, which is 120 million people, and we were trying to get the vaccination rate up for small children. It's well below what it should be, and that was causing high infant mortality. And the solution in the end was to give the vaccinators a tablet, which was geotagged. And that meant that every child who was vaccinated, was a photograph taken, and the photograph went instantly into a computer in Lahore. So you knew exactly which children had been vaccinated and where they were. And often you had the mobile phone number of the mother, and you could ring the call centre, could ring and check that that was accurate. But what that gave you was a perfect, or nearly perfect map of where the vaccinated children were and where the unvaccinated ones were, and then you could do very targeted response. And I think as we go into this next phase of coming out of the COVID-19 crisis, obviously there'll still need to be clear direction from the national level, but there will need to be a lot of variation at local level, and then we need to be precision in the responses. And then more generally on the crisis, we need to learn about future crises. I did a session a bit like this with Latin American leaders last week, and the guy from Chile said that he thought we should see the COVID-19 crisis as a rehearsal for the climate emergency to come. So
Okay, thank you. Question about public trust and lost trust in the government. One could argue public trust taken something of a bit of a hammering over the last few days. But in terms of rebuilding that trust, which is most important, empathy or competence? Open that to whoever wants to jump in.
do you want to go first, Joanna, or do you want me to?
You want to go first?
I think that in a crisis, you need, and I thought Joanna described it beautifully at the beginning. You need both competence and empathy. But to be honest, if I had to choose, I'd choose competence. I'm talking about governments in general. A good friend who used to be the Premier of Western Cape province in South Africa, she talks about having learnt the importance of a capable state. And you see that can be applied at local level or anywhere in the world. I look at, say, New South Wales in Australia, where I've been working for a while with the Premier there, Gladys Berejiklian, and she won an election, rather surprisingly, a re-election last year. She was kind of in the polls, but when it came to it, the opposition accused her of being boring, and her response was, "Yes, I am. I just do the job," and that actually turned the whole climate. So that sense of being competent is really important. Obviously, you've got empathy as well. So much the better.
Joanna, do you have anything to add on the empathy, the competence question?
My view is exactly the same. I mean, citizens want us to be sort of uber competent, don't they? And I think one of the necessary things in a crisis is to keep things going as much as you can in the most competent way. You know, people still want their bins collected. They still want to be able to, you know, have a pothole. You know, all of that stuff. It's a sort of competence issue, isn't it? And we should do it well. And there's no point having loads of, you know, empathy for a frail elderly person in a home that's, you know, infected with COVID if you can't get a sort of hyper competent group of staff to look after them. So I could have all the empathy in the world, but you need really sort of competent, able, reliable, consistently brilliant services, I think. That's how you earn trust.
We've had a couple of questions about kind of sort of, I suppose you could call it issues of sort of personal resilience, and we had a webinar last week actually on that. So thinking about the kind of burnout, mental health, well-being of staff. How do we build in time to? How important is that to build in time to ensure that those issues are paid attention to?
Shall I start?
Yeah.
I think this has been a real sort of big learning for me personally. I think as the sort of crisis started, you could see many people sort of moving into overdrive, working incredibly long hours, 7 days a week, in frontline roles, often away from colleagues, having to adapt rapidly to working at home using Teams, Zoom, but with the added issues of young children, caring responsibility, background anxiety. I mean, it's been really tough, hasn't it? But this was one of the sort of immediate sort of early learnings about the requirement to almost instruct our people to adopt a different way of working, to take rest days, to require managers to stop their people working sometimes. It was obvious that people were going to sort of burn out. Many of my staff, they're in their jobs because they want to help people, so their instinct is to keep working and working and working, but, that's not tenable or doesn't deliver sort of competent services in the long run. So we have had to adopt and require there to be different working practice for some groups of our people. We've introduced a whole range of additional sort of mental health support, a whole suite of tools to enable people to get the support they need. We have encouraged different team ways of working across Teams, Zoom, all of this, but it has taken its toll, actually, and it's taken its toll on some people who've had to work outside role, work outside their sort of preferences. We've also had to redeploy people to do some really difficult things. They volunteered for it, but, we've had 20, 30 additional people sort of registering deaths, working in new mortuaries that we've had to put in place. I mean, it's been really tough for them. So we have provided additional support. It's been life-changing for some. They won't go back into the roles they were doing before. They feel sort of liberated doing new things. But overall, it's been extraordinary for people. But we have recognised the sort of toll, in particular for young workers that we have in living in shared houses. Having to work on their beds with a laptop, all day, every day. Not great. Loneliness, isolation has really impacted them as well. So big lessons about workforce for the future, I think.
I would just add to Joanna's comment, I agree with everything Joanna said. I'd just add one thing which I think is it's important that as a leader, and this is about leadership in a crisis, to be able to kind of spell out a narrative of where we've come from through the crisis, where we're going and where where we are now and where we're going next, and to be able to do that, to give people a sense of we're making, even though it feels really hard, we're making progress and maybe the end is coming in sight. I mean, obviously Churchill did that brilliantly in the war that everybody remembers, but Delivery Associates is a much smaller organisation than Surrey County Council. We're about 60 or 70 people all spread around the world. We've been working on Zoom for years. We don't have an office. But the first thing we did, when the crisis hit, the first thing we did was you get a sense of disbelief. So the first response to a crisis does not really be happening. But then we realised in that moment, actually what we had to do was get everybody home. Wherever they were working in the world, they had to get home. And so it was a big logistical thing of getting them. One person was going from the Caribbean to New Zealand, for example, but the whole set of complicated but rapid, so people believe it and then see competence. And then the second phase, they sort of they accommodate it. Say, oh, so it's going to be like this, and then we find ways of keeping the work going, even though people are now not on location with the governments we're working with. And that's where creativity is being fundamental. And then in the third phase, which is we're very much into now, is and we've been discussing on this, is strategic repositioning. So we came to terms with it, we accommodated it, and now we're strategic repositioning. What are the benefits of this for government? What are the benefits for us? How can we seize the advantages, whether it's the data points we've been discussing, whether it's the fact that for our staff, they'll be travelling less in the near future because of the various restrictions. And while that may be a disbenefit, it's also an opportunity to focus on your own health and well-being. So I think that having that sense of the phases you're going through helps people understand what's happening at a given moment and where they might be going, so it won't always be like this and they don't get into despair.
Thank you. A question about thinking about planning beyond the crisis. Is the next crisis likely to be the financial constraints to pay off the debt obviously the government's had to take on, and is there any planning underway for that, and how's leadership dealing with that prospect? Thoughts about the sort of are we heading into another financial crisis?
I'm happy to start, but yep. I'm also happy to, Joanna.
Do you want
to start?
Yeah, I'll go. Look, I have mentioned the Second World War twice. The last payment under the Lend-Lease agreement, where Britain borrowed lots of money, mainly in the form of equipment from the US during the war. The last repayment of that was made in 2007. And I think that the level of debt is going to be of that kind of scale. So this is the good news is that interest rates are very low, at least for the moment. So that is going to be an issue. And the Treasury, I think, has had an outstanding crisis, really performed very, very well during this last few months, and Chancellor's leadership has been great. So they have to address these issues for all of us now, and that will mean thinking about getting value for every tax pound, as it were, in the way that I was talking about earlier, but it also mean managing the debt in ways that they will have to do. And what's different is from Lend-Lease is everybody's in debt, and America obviously wasn't back then. So it is going to be a challenging time for governments, and finding new ways of doing things. Innovation will be fundamental to that. And I must say, local authorities around Britain, some of them anyway, have done a fantastic job of that in a challenging last 10 years, and the next 10 years are not going to be easy for anybody.
Joanna, some thoughts on the finances?
Yeah, our sort of working assumption has been, although we've had some additional shots of cash from government over the last couple of months, actually we're in for a really difficult few years, along with, the economy, UK PLC generally. So we are beginning to plan on that basis. But I do think there are, maybe it's just me, but I think there are some sort of opportunities that will flow from this, that will generate some sort of new ideas and concepts and ways of working that we're going to have to go with, actually. Sort of digital transformation, is a pretty, obvious one. Sort of changes in the way that we sort of deliver support and care with colleagues in health. This thing hasn't sort of exposed some fissures that we should definitely exploit. But I suppose it's just the context in which we do that. Particularly how we see the economy sort of delivering high levels of worklessness, particularly for young people. So definitely some sort of opportunities. I think we're planning for a difficult few years, but we've been, with a really tough context for some members of our society, even in a place like Surrey, I think it's going to be really difficult. But I think as leaders, given the sort of what's happened over the last few months, the sort of psyche in some of our communities, the anxiety, I think there has to be a different sort of, like narrative as we go into that. You know, I think my organisation would sort of collapse if it was a sort of another sort of savings austerity sort of narrative. You know, I think as leaders, it's just how we sort of continue to work with our residents, politicians, staff, to sort of paint a picture of the future and how we get there with a different set of resources. I just think another sort of austerity mindset just won't sort of do it this time. I think the mood has changed.
Really want to reinforce that point from Joanna. We do need to find a new narrative and a more visionary direction than a new bout of austerity would create. My favourite politician on this subject is former 10-year Prime Minister of Mozambique, Luisa Diogo, in the century, who talks about the role of government is to unlock the music in people, and reviving the economy about unlocking the music in people.
Yeah, I agree.
Does the panel, another question from a listener, does the panel feel that lessons learned from the COVID-19 experience is going to help in the planning for the finality of Brexit? Michael, maybe that's a good one for you, given you've been talking about the jury.
Actually, the answer to that question for me is I don't know. I'm hoping that the lessons are being learned and will be applied, but I imagine it appears to have been inevitably a distraction from getting on with that job, and that task, which for the last 3 years was the only task we really debated, now is going to be waiting to be done. And I hope the government will go into that with the right spirit of getting it done in the best way for Britain. But I honestly don't know how the lessons will be learned. Some of the politicians at the heart of it will have learned a lot about themselves and about how to manage pricing, and may have. I don't know the details.
Okay. Perhaps going back to the question of empathy versus competence, we've had a question about competence. Does the panel feel that competence is a duality, so between operational competence and strategic competence? And perhaps a follow-up, does the panel feel that potentially inefficient operational delivery has taken excessive precedence over strategic thinking and process improvements? Michael, do you want to come in on that one?
I answered the last two questions first, so I was giving way to Joanna.
Joanna?
So I think sort of competence has to be a sort of feature at a strategic level, sort of political level, but it also has to be, you know, there has to be sort of tactical competence, doesn't there? And along with sort of competence at a sort of strategic level, you know, there has to be ingredients around, you know, innovation, sort of creativity, a bit of empathy, you know, as you're sort of designing, as you're thinking about a vision and an ambition, your priorities, you know, they have to come together, you know, in a competent way, but it has to be driven by lots of other sort of features of good leadership. But at the end of the day, you know, taxpayers expect, you know, consistently good services delivered in a sort of competent, sort of transparent way. So sort of visionary ideas have to land sort of properly in a way that, you know, citizens would wish to experience them as well. You know, thinking about sort of good process, you know, it's no bad thing, is it? But, you know, more than ever, I think as we come out of this crisis, as Michael was talking about, there will be, I think, much more sort of challenge about sort of value. I think there'll be much more, I think, encouragement to sort of tackle the big issues that were there before, but that will be there in front of us, and we've got to do those, you know, creatively, but they've got to land sort of competently. So Michael quite rightly has sort of talked about sort of climate change. Just last month, actually, in the middle of all of this, we adopted sort of greener future strategy, which I think is one of the best pieces of work that we've done, you know, using great input from our residents, but, you know, world-class science, and it's sort of a roadmap for us about tackling climate change. And I think, you know, as we've come out of sort of COVID, it's been extraordinary, you know, the sort of behaviour change that we've seen. And I don't want to let any of that go. So it's just, how can you sort of continue to sort of make a compelling argument for behaviour change to address climate change? You know, how do you think about sort of resetting your organisation, delivering a sort of green economy? You need the big ideas, but you've got to get them to land, to work, haven't you? And to do all you can to make sure that you know, people see the benefits of that in the short term, but, you know, compel and encourage people to sort of have patience for the longer term as well.
Yeah, I agree, and I'll just add that I think the way the question was put is a duality, that you have to be sort of operationally competent, add to that Joanna's point, technical competence, and strategically competent. I think to be a capable state, you have to, whether it's a local authority or a national government, I think you do have to be competent at both those levels. I think one or the other is not enough. And you know, we all respect governments when we see. I was very struck by watching Justin Trudeau in Canada in his first term, not just sort of deliver some of the short-term goals that he committed to on growing the economy, greater immigration, and all the rest of it, but also thinking ahead to the climate challenge ahead, introducing carbon pricing, and then battling that out through an election campaign. So there's somebody who's been short-term, largely operationally competent, and then strategic in thinking about the future.
We are coming up to 11, so just one final question, perhaps with hopefully quite. Let's try and keep the answers brief. Are there any potential silver linings in these COVID clouds? Joanna, one for you, and then Michael.
I think, you know, absolutely the sort of change in the use of sort of data intelligence, got to grab hold of that. And my other cheeky one would be just sort of the most positive impact there's been on sort of the environment over the last few weeks because of our change in movement patterns.
Okay, Michael.
I agree. I agree with both those things. I think there are real opportunities, and the challenge, whether you're an individual school or a hospital or a local authority or the whole country, or indeed the world, the challenge is to seize those opportunities. And I think that is going to be one of the leadership tasks at each level in our country and the world. And the thing I'd like to see most, and haven't seen enough of in the last year or so, is global leadership with some kind of vision of how these big changes that are going to be needed can be made.
Thank you very much. I'd like to, I'm going to bring the webinar to a close there. I'd like to thank Sir Michael Barber and Joanna Killian again for joining us and giving us some of their time and sharing their insights and expertise with us. A big thank you to everyone who has tuned in this morning. We will be making a recording of the webinar available on our YouTube channel in the next few days, and we will be emailing out a link to that. We're also going to be making the slides from today available to delegates. So if you did miss any part of the webinar you missed, or if you would like to share it with a colleague, you'll be able to do so. But again, thank you again from me to all our delegates and to Sir Michael Barber and Joanna Killian. Thank you very much.
Thank you.